All right, welcome. Let me call this session to order. Thank you for coming. I am delighted, excited by what we're about to do. As some of you may know, annually the Organizational Behavior Division of the Academy of Management sponsors a plenary session that becomes an ongoing initiative throughout the course of a year that we call Spotlight. Last year, the focus was on inequity. So we've taken topics that are important in the OB field that are also a bit charged in some ways. We have things that are important to talk about, maybe even some sources of conflict or even consciousness raising. So inequity was a topic last year. This year, our topic is ethics, which we are casting in terms of the what and the why and the how. I'll make this clear as we move forward and what those three questions are and how we'll approach them. I'd like to welcome our esteemed panelists who are up here. We have an all-star cast, and I really mean that from my heart. Ed Freeman, right here, is the University Professor and Olson Professor of Business Administration at the Darden School at the University of Virginia. Well-established scholar in the area of ethics, and if you've heard of stakeholder theory, then you know Ed Freeman's work, and much work since then. So we're very delighted to have Ed with us. Linda Trevino is a distinguished professor of OB and ethics at Smeal College of Business at Penn State University. Also, as you can see, the director of their Shoemaker program in business ethics. Again, a major contributor to the field of ethics from perhaps more of a behavioral ethics standpoint, and then also has written some seminal works that help us guide our way of how we teach and think about ethics from a managerial perspective. Kelly Knoll, as here on the end, is a Senior Vice President and Chief Ethics Officer and Compliance Officer, Chief Privacy Officer at the Allstate Corporation, headquartered here in Chicago. Kelly is largely leadership role in creating the ethical climate reputation of what Allstate is about. There's an organization called Ethisphere that you may have heard of that annually identifies the world's most ethical companies. Allstate has been named on that list for 4 years running, and Kelly has a lot to do with that. Mark Ohringer just recently retired from his position as a Executive Vice President, General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary of Jones Lang LaSalle, or JLL. Like Allstate, JLL has been identified as one of the world's most ethical companies in their listings 11 years running, and Mark has had a great deal to do with that. Denise Rousseau, as you've known her in various roles at the Academy of Management. She's the H.J. Heinz II University Professor of OB and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University and their Heinz College of Information System and Public Policy, but also is jointly affiliated with the Tepper School of Business. Denise is, I guess, concluding your term as the Academy of Management Ethics Education Officer. Is that correct? Adjudication, yes. Okay, adjudication officer. So that means that she sees and handles ethical issues within the Academy of Management. And finally, Kathy Lundeen, here to my right, Board of Trustees, Distinguished Professor of Leadership and Ethics, Professor of Management Economics and Management at Gustavus Adolphus College, recently co-authored a book on the ethical professor and conducted a session on that topic yesterday. And it's high time for us to have a focus on ethics in our profession, and so this is going to be, it'll stand as a landmark piece in that area. So join me in welcoming our panelists, please. Let me lay out some of the key issues we'll address, the what and the why and the how. So we're going to start with some opening statements by each of our panelists, and I've organized them into pairs, if you will, around the what and the why and the how. And then we're going to move to more of a free-form discussion where we'll invite our panelists to react to what one another has said about the topics that are their starting points and move toward integration. So in terms of the what we study, so Ed Freeman and Linda Trevino have graciously agreed to anchor that opening discussion. And some of the questions that we might consider are, what are the findings that are reasonably well established In ethics research, what are the key unanswered questions? What's being neglected or overlooked from a research standpoint? Are there areas of controversy or conflict in the field, and how might we resolve those? So as voices of the body of scholarly work in ethics, we have Ed and Linda. Kelly Knoll and Mark Ohringer, as representing companies that have established reputations for being models of ethical management practice. Some questions that they have agreed to consider are, what are some of the critical ethical issues that businesses confront today? When we move to integration, we'll be able to consider whether those issues are in fact part of the research agenda of our field, for instance. Why is it important for businesses to identify and resolve ethical issues? I myself teach a course on ethical leadership at the Keenan Flagler Business School at UNC, and this is a question that's constantly on the minds of my students, is why does it matter from a business, why do ethics matter from a business standpoint? So what is gained in terms of reputation? What is gained in terms of the practices that occur within organizations? And what are some ways that in which business can achieve excellence in ethics? What has it taken to be identified as the world's most ethical companies? How does that happen? How do you make that work? We have some lessons I'm sure we can learn from those who have been in leadership roles around that effort. How we study, how we conduct ourselves as academics from an ethical standpoint. And Denise and Kathy have agreed to share some thoughts on a few points here. What are the emerging ethical issues in the conduct of management research? If you've seen what I've seen, in some ways we're in kind of an ethical crisis in research in general and in management research in particular. Are our findings replicable? How are we conducting and presenting the work we do? Is there full disclosure in terms of what we do? How do we manage all that goes on behind the scenes in terms of who are the authors of papers, how we position our work, and a whole litany of issues. So what are some of those emerging issues that are coming to the fore? How does the fulfillment or violation of principles around research ethics impact the development of knowledge? Again, does it matter? If we strive to conduct ourselves as ethical researchers, ethical professors, what's gained by that other than doing the right thing, which of course is important? Is there material gain as well in terms of the knowledge we generate? And finally, what can and should academics do to conduct their work ethically and encourage others to do so? These are simply some starting points, and this is an opening gambit, if you will. Where our distinguished panelists will take these questions is certainly up to them. I'll invite each of them to go in the order you see here to address the issues that I've asked them to consider. And so let's all listen. Let's all prepare maybe some reactions or some questions, and I'm going to ask all of you to do the same with one another. So we begin with the what and the why and the how of ethics. For the what of ethics, let's have, Ed, would you like to go first?
No, but I will.
Okay, all right. Okay, all right.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not sure I have anything really very useful to say. I have a couple of roles that I want to acknowledge. I'm the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Business Ethics, and we have a section on organization behavior and ethics, and a section on behavioral ethics, and one on psychology and ethics. So we actually publish a fair amount of, I would say, OB and ethics papers. Well, as I tried to deal with Jeff's questions, again, and I'm a philosopher in the second role, and as a philosopher, I'm one of those weird pragmatists who thinks that most of business school research is a sort of 1940s positivism that we ought to drop. So I just want to acknowledge that in the beginning. That's why most of what I have to say won't be very useful, I think. For starters, we never talk about findings. We talk about arguments. What's the argument for this? And the findings, the data, the implications support the arguments. And so oftentimes we'll get papers as an editor that says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Help me understand what the argument is for why this is interesting, why it's important. How does it fit into the other ethics conversations, etc. There are a lot of what I would call OB issues By the way, most frighteningly, I used to teach organization behavior at Wharton, so it's really scary to me now. Most of the issues in organization behavior are relevant to ethics. But many of the papers I've seen as an editor seem to be afraid of making normative claims. They seem to go out of their way not to make normative claims, as if you can clearly distinguish what's normative from what's not. As a pragmatist, I think that's an impossible line to draw, and it's just the way that language works. There's a great example from a book I would recommend to everybody called The End of the Fact-Value Dichotomy by Hilary Putnam. And Putnam's example is an example of cruel. Let's say that I call someone who tortures pets, and I say, Dan is cruel. Have I done something that's factual? Sure. I mean, I know how to apply the word cruel, and torturing pets turns out to be cruel. There may be some disagreement about it. If the pet's a cat and people hate cats, well, there's some argument about that. But for the most part, we would say somebody who tortures pets is cruel. Have I done something that's normative? Sure, I've applied this word that talks about character, to this person. So which is it, fact or value? And the answer is yes, both. It's also interpretive in that whatever moral theory I have about cruelty to animals, etc., is there as well. So the idea that we can separate out facts from values from the interpretation of the background theory is an idea that pragmatists would say we should essentially drop. The second sort of pragmatist idea is that it's hard you can't distinguish data and theory in the sense that the data stands in a relationship called confirmation to theory. This is the old positivist idea. Dewey told us a long time ago that if the theory wasn't somehow contained partially in the data, how would you know it was the right data for the theory? So what I would say is, in terms of what we need more of, is I think we need more explicit ethics arguments in OB. And it's not that it's ethics arguments instead of thinking about experience and data and those kinds of things. It's an and. It has to be both of those things. I think what we need is more acknowledgement of kind of what problems we're trying to solve. For pragmatists, theories and research are tools. They don't get at some underlying way the world absolutely has to be. There's a long tradition in philosophy and ethics. It's not something you have to know a lot about. Again, if you just read Putnam's book, that's pretty much all you ever need to know about this stuff. So in closing, I would say, and I probably haven't answered Jeff's questions at all, what we do as intellectuals, how we interpret our experiences and the experiences of others that we write about, has an ethical component. We need to acknowledge that so we can improve it, etc. The same is true in science, by the way. Read Richard Feynman's On Cargo Cult Science, and that'll sort of lay that out in a way. The idea, therefore, we need to see hope and freedom as the goals of what we do, and realize that truth reminds us that the evidence is not always in. We have to remake the world, and we can't hide or pretend that the normative part isn't there with, of course, the empirical part, etc. So I'll stop there. How did I do it?
Very good, very good. Ed has given us a mission, a charge, if you will, responsibility for what we are doing as academics, and are we simply pursuing arguments, or are we taking stands on what we can say? Linda, would you
Sure.
contribute to this line of thinking?
So I just want to make sure I know what I'm supposed to be doing. So,
Not what I just did.
so you asked us to talk about what findings are reasonably well established, But you also asked us to talk about key unanswered questions or neglected areas and controversy and conflict. Are those other two for later or for now?
No, it's a bundle of thought prompts
It's
for
a
you.
bundle of thought prompts.
I
Okay.
ignored all three of them at once.
Yes,
Yeah,
you
oh,
did.
yeah, so you
yeah,
could- or you could-
yeah.
or you could
Well,
talk about the fourth thing.
that's exactly what we expected from you, Ed. Okay. So when I was first asked to do this, and I said I would have Jeff said I would have 5 minutes to do it. I just said, I can't possibly do that. But it did prompt me to think back to 30 years ago when I first started this journey. And actually, then the first thing that came to my mind is that we know a lot. Clearly, there's a lot we don't know, but we know a lot more than we did 30 years ago when, if you called this kind of a session, I might have been the only person in the room, maybe with Ed. So I think we've come a long way. And there have been, the number of studies that have been conducted in what I would call OB-related areas and ethics has just grown exponentially. And we've looked at all sorts of things. We try to understand what it is about people that makes them behave either ethically or unethically, and we know a lot about that. We also are very interested in context, so things like leadership and climate and culture and peer influence, all of those things, turns out, matter. We actually have enough research conducted that in 2010, colleagues and I were able to conduct a meta-analysis, so that's pretty amazing when you think about the fact that 30 years ago, we really had very few studies. So we were able to find that there are a number of individual differences that do seem to really matter, things like Machiavellianism, for example, contextual factors like climate and culture, and interestingly, for the practitioners at the table, codes of conduct by themselves turned out to be fairly useless. I call them, in today's world, the wallpaper. They're there, but you have to really enforce them and build them into the culture in order for them to have an impact, and that's what we found. There's been a lot of research in the laboratory, behavioral laboratory, and things like ethical cues, frames matter a lot. So the way we cue people to think in ethical terms matters. I helped to birth this construct of ethical leadership, and there have been, I think, hundreds of studies now that are very supportive of the importance of ethical leadership at all levels. So not just the top, but very much down through the organization. Research on goals and how, there's the famous Goals Gone Wild paper that I think has been influential. And if you think about some of the examples like Wells Fargo, you can easily apply that. Some of the key unanswered questions, and I got some of these ideas from a PDW that some of my friends and I put on Saturday. So one area that remains unanswered, I think, or neglected, is just when we study this from a social scientific perspective, do we have a clear definition or idea of exactly what we mean by ethical behavior and unethical behavior? I mean, that sounds like, you got to have that, but when you step back and think about it, you realize you've got some work to do. The other thing is that the meso level is really neglected. So we've done a lot of research, especially in the last decade or so, in the behavioral laboratory. It's very micro, but trying to understand, I think of myself as being interested in organizational ethics, so trying to understand what's going on across layers in the organization is something it's very hard to study because it's hard to get in organizations. Hint, hint. The other thing that I've become interested in that we don't know much about at all is what happens in groups. Groups are really hard to study. Some of you may know that from your own research. I dipped my toe in that water this past year or so, and it's really, really challenging, but a lot of ethical decisions get made in a group context, so we need to know more about that. And I think we know more about cognition than we do about affect. So if you think about how, we know that now, thanks to Jonathan Haidt and other people, that ethical decision-making is actually a very affective process. So, how do we understand that part of it is really important. And I think this idea of the need for replication and if we're talking about ethics inside the organization and how that impacts the business, I think, boy, we have a long ways to go to understand the payoff. And we'd love to do more of that research. In terms of controversies and conflict, I actually had a little trouble thinking about this one, but I think we have discussions in the field about, lab versus field research. Obviously, we all say the nice things about how we should combine them and triangulate, and sometimes that's easier said than done. And then I think Ed already mentioned something related to this, but there's this controversy about the extent to which the normative and the social scientific are kind of at odds versus need to be integrated. And so those are kind of top of mind ideas.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being so thorough, and thank you for aptly demonstrating that 5 minutes was far too short to ask. But
Sorry, how long did I take?
It was as long as it should be, is what it was.
You are kind.
Thank you, Linda.
Kind.
No, we're fine. We're on track. I think you're able. The depth of what you're saying is more important than the speed, and so I appreciate what you've said for all of us. Let's shift gears now to the why. Kelly Nola and Mark Oringer, as I've already mentioned to you, have held leadership roles in major corporations that have been identified for their ethics and held up as examples. And there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in terms of how that comes about. A lot of grappling with the question of why ethics matters and how you can bring about an ethical climate practice within an organization. Kelly, would you say a few words from your perspective at all?
Certainly. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I think one of the things when I think about this topic is, from a practitioner standpoint, is that no two companies are the same. So what works for my company might not work for Mark's company, might not work for somebody else down the road. So you really have to tailor to your organization, your business model. Are you domestic? Are you global? How complex are you? That type of thing. But when I look at things that are kind of some of the critical issues of today, I thought I'd just keep it to two. And one is just really the pace of change. The world is changing very fast. There's new competitors coming into the marketplace. You look at the startups, you look how fast they're moving, the things people are doing. And we're an 86-year-old company, fairly conservative. We've always kind of done things A, B, C. We're getting in some ways that are non-traditional for us, different types of businesses, that type of thing. And how do you compete in that marketplace, and how do you be relevant? But the key same time is how do you instill the values we have as a corporation into a newer group like that, which very candidly tends to be much younger, used to doing things faster, and doesn't necessarily have I'll say the loyalty, if you want to call it, those kinds of things. How do you instill the key things that you expect of an employee regardless of where they are within our brand or where they sit around the globe, that type of thing. So for me, that's one of the challenges that we face. The second is just the whole issue around data and how companies use data nowadays. Privacy is one of my other parts of my job, so it's real important to me, but you read more and more about it in the news, you've seen things. Companies have much more data on all of us than I think most of us realize. How do companies use it? What's ethical about it? Just because you've got it, can you use it? Those types of questions I think are more and more ones that have to be debated and talked about, that type of thing. As to why it's important for businesses to be concerned about ethics, I always tell people it's kind of like a duh. Who doesn't want to work for an ethical company when you think about it at the end of the day? But research that I've seen and I've talked to folks about is that shows that companies who have higher ethical cultures provide a higher rate of return on equity for their investors. That's a key thing, draws people in to see what kind of company you are. I have countless employees that will tell me that they came to us because of our reputation as an ethical company and what they would expect and how they felt they could act and knowing that they would be able to raise issues and those types of things. And then lastly, just from my experience as a leader, one of the key things is you do have to lead by example as a leader. Your leaders have to be out there talking about it. They have to demonstrate that they're making decisions in an ethical manner. I always tell folks, as a leader, you're always on stage. Your people are watching you. They're going to see how you react to things. They're going to see how you answer questions. They're going to see if you really put into play the things you talk about. So your leaders always have to be showing up in that role, and they have to be talking about it. Employees will tell you that if they at least hear their leaders talking about ethics on a frequent basis, doesn't have to be every week, that type of thing, they're much more likely to really truly believe that they work within an ethical culture and they've got the opportunity to raise issues or concerns as they see them. So.
All right, very good. Thank you. Thank you for a very concise and thorough rundown of the questions that I've asked you to consider. Pace of change, uniqueness of what companies are about, no two companies are the same. The link between ethics and rate of return, and you've got to walk the talk and be an example as a leader in an ethical, to establish an ethical climate. Mark, would you say a few words, please?
Yeah, thank you. I want to throw a little bit of a bomb, which is, I would say the state of ethics in corporations and then organizations, that are non-public, both business and not-for-profit, is still pretty pathetic 5,000 years after the snake first appeared in the garden. And I know this because I read the newspaper every day. And in spite of all the work that's been done and all the kinds of training and all the things we've all put into it, we still see these egregious situations at major institutions by people who should have known better. And for every one of those you read about in the paper, take it from me, there's about 1,000 you don't read about, maybe 10,000, which is to say the only ones that hit the newspaper are the CEOs and the CFOs. But every company has, and even ones that call themselves ethical companies, and what that means in my world is not that bad things don't happen or that we're all angels, but that we clean up our messes transparently and effectively and openly, and we don't put them under the rug. Although it's astonishing to me how many companies still put things under the rug. You saw it very recently at CBS, for example. I just read a book about Theranos called Bad Blood, which is real-time situation. And if you want to see what goes on with very smart people in very smart parts of the world, read that book. I couldn't put it down. I just finished it last night. So somehow we are not getting the message to the people on the ground. And is it impossible? I don't know. But we're not getting to the people who are in charge of things, and that can be a manager, one person, or that can be a CEO, and somehow figure out how to, well, two things. One, how to keep them from straying, because these are smart people, and the things they're doing are not in gray areas. In my world, when a new ethics complaint comes in, it's sex or money, and there's nothing else. It's very simple to categorize this stuff. And so somehow people aren't able to keep themselves from doing these things. So the training we're giving is ineffective, one. And two, there is no data, I completely agree. Nobody, living or dead, actually knows the extent of all of the ethics lapses. If you even just took the Fortune 500 companies, nobody has a clue about what's going on in these places because there are no reporting requirements. those are the companies that probably are probably the only places that are actually tracking their data, and they're keeping it a big secret. So even in most of these companies, you couldn't find out what goes on because this is the ultimate dirty laundry that they've got. They don't like to talk about it. It's sitting someplace in the law department. One thing we did at my company that I was very proud of, if you go to jll.com, you can find our very specific ethics data. How many complaints we had, how many we resolved, how many people we fired every year. But we're one of the few companies that do that. I think General Electric used to do it, and it's gotten really hard to find in their site. But if you go to the Fortune 500, and I'd be interested if I'm wrong on this, I don't think you can get the data. And it's also not required to be reported anywhere. Under the accounting rules, somebody has to put out 200 pages of accounting data. There's nothing in there about ethics unless it's a material situation, which pretty much means it has to be the CEO. So we're completely flying blind from a management perspective. This is the last frontier of data. Google can tell you who's a Democrat and a Republican by the music they order, but they cannot tell you anything truly about what goes on in companies in terms of ethics. And then you don't even get started on like academic institutions where we've had terrible problems. Penn State, Michigan State, USC, Ohio State. Every week there's a new one. I bet they don't even track this stuff. And then you get into privately held companies that don't have to have a code of conduct and don't have to have a hotline. They're not doing it either. And God only knows what training they're doing. And the one last thing I would say is even when you do training, it was just fascinating, this article about Les Moonves that was in the New Yorker that I just read, which you should also read. So at CBS, they weren't only complaining about him, there was, management issues at 60 Minutes, for God's sakes. And then, so they say, well, we had sexual harassment training. You find out, they go to talk to the administrative assistants, and they're like, yeah, my boss told me to go take the training for him. So even if you think you have good online training, you don't even know if somebody's taking it. So for all these reasons, I actually think we have very, very far to go. There's no information, and we really don't know how to stop this stuff.
That was, yeah, quite an ouch. Thank you for the consciousness-raising status report on what you see in the corporate world. Things to grapple with, and as you pointed out, academic institutions are not immune from these issues that we're on the table for today, which is a good transition point into the how of ethics. How we conduct ourselves as academics. We are part and parcel of the institutions such as the ones that Mark just named. And I would venture to guess, as Mark, as you said, that there's not much documentation that goes on in terms of the ethical behavior and violations that we might see. And so we've begun to shine more of a light on that and take a closer look by the existence of the ethics area for the Academy management at large and provides oversight. And so I'm going to ask Denise to please share a few words on what you've experienced and what you've seen and what are some of the issues in play for our Academy.
Right. Well, as far as I'm concerned, this session couldn't come at a better time. So I thank you so much for the concept and for the invitation and the composition. This is really, we're very blessed to have you guys here. I'm talking to you from this perspective. I'm just transitioning out of 6 years on the Ethics Adjudication Committee, 3 as a member, 3 as the chair. It has been the most unpleasant Academy service I've ever engaged in, but perhaps one of the more important things. I got into it because when I was Academy president, I wanted to do one thing, but I got tasks. It's like you play catch. The issue I caught was we needed an ethics code. And it is true, the code of conduct don't mean diddly squat unless you build it into the fiber of the organization. But you have to start from something to begin that construction. And so we started in 2004 with our ethics code. And the goal at that time was to create, I'll think of it as an architecture. So here's the code of conduct, vetted with many members, many divisions, long process. Then we're going to create a way of educating So the idea was that there would be training and development in the PDWs and other aspects of the organization, including, you could say this is an extension, our gathering today. And then there was going to be a remedy process. First, an ombuds person or ombuds team of people who are so good and so patient and so knowledgeable, with people coming with issues where they had a concern or a real distress and wondered, is this problem me or is there something in the situation? Those kinds of circumstances. The ombuds people do probably the most significant role because they deal with distressed members and ethical concerns. Many ethical concerns are outside the purview of the academy. They may violate the code, but we only have enforcement capabilities when it's an academy-related activity. In those cases where no remedy is attained through the ombuds process and it's an academy activity, it potentially is a case that can be tried within the academy justice ethics system, and that's where the adjudication committee comes in, is people submit, following what's on the website, a brief asserting an ethics code violation in the purview of the academy officer behavior, proceedings, publications, academy journal activity, bad behavior at the social tonight. So, you know, it's an academy context that we have some responsibility for protecting people, and cases can give rise to that. And then our committee, we vet it to see, is there a violation? Come on, I would use a legal term, prima facie evidence, as a psychologist thinks of it.
Way to go.
Yeah, best I could do. Do we have reasonable assertion of a violation of some part of the code, and then a panel reviews it. But we have a process. The defendants provide their information. We go through a process. A decision is made. If the decision is that a violation has occurred, we publish the findings. And so there are records of all cases, so you can note the cases and the findings, but confidentiality is kept. But if there's a finding, that'll be announced in academy communications that somebody has been found guilty of violation and there's a sanction. There almost always is a sanction. The key idea, I just want to understand the architecture to know that that's what it is. But let me come to the point of the issue of, I'm the how, right? So, right, okay, so what I've learned from this process is this almost tragic, very sad cases that finally surface. They are, of course, the tip of the iceberg. Most cases don't fall under the academy adjudication guidelines. They happened in another journal. They happened at somebody's home institution. They happened in ways that we don't adjudicate. But the tip of the iceberg is real. So if I've handled 10 cases in the last year, I'm sure there are 100 cases that are out there in some context or another. One of the key ideas that I'm gonna lead with my key idea in terms of what I have learned, and that is manage expectations, manage expectations, manage expectations. I'm a psychological contracts researcher, and one of the things that's old quote is, half the promises never kept were never made, but nonetheless we form beliefs, and to some extent the process is an attempt for people to get social fact or social corroboration of what they believe to be true, but it's very difficult to prove the fact of a subjective belief without a paper trail and exchanges being made. The most difficult issue that I see repeated over and over again, and I think this is a condition that is there's a special place in purgatory, not hell, but purgatory, for advisors who have multiple people working on the same data set, because people have unclear notions of intellectual property, of what their rights for publication are, and are often very vulnerable to the advisor's decisions on what happens to aspects of the data or aspects of the field process. That critical issue in all of these is no initial discussion on the part of the people participating in a project about ownership, authorship, rights at the outset. Kahneman and Tversky taught us it's primacy over recency. There's no way that a down-the-road, kick-the-can conversation about who owns what or who's entitled to what is going to produce the level of satisfaction of knowing going in what the terms of your formal work arrangements are, and to get that up front. And if there's a change, then there's a conversation later. There might be a little bit difficult conversation, but it's a hell of a lot easier conversation than if you've never talked about issues of who's entitled to what. So primacy over recency, manage expectations, key idea. And I guess the last thing that I want to reinforce, the key idea that our practitioner colleagues have shared with us, which is this importance of leading by example. And the notion here is a critical part of the Academy's ethic architecture is education. But in an organization that has lots of members, and we're growing and growing, education has to be ongoing. And then the practice and conversation and discussion about ethical issues and conduct has to be ongoing. And it's our role as people in this community is to make a regular space for ethics education, but also for the conversations about ethical issues. And one of the problems has been in the last, and I understand why, having had all these other academy roles over the years, the proper place to some extent for ethics education is in the PDWs. But the doctoral consortia and the new doctoral consortium people don't want to give up space for ethics because there's all this other stuff. What are you saying? What are we saying when we say I haven't time to have an ethics discussion with these new doctoral students or these new members? Is that really what we want to say? Because that is what we are saying. Ouch. And always trade-offs. This is not something to trade against. It's way too central. And I will say, if you had an idea of the suffering that people who file suits are experiencing, whether they ultimately find their case supported or not, the pain is huge. And I resonate with what Ed had said. What problem are we trying to solve? I mean, there's two problems that are central in my thinking, and I think it bears here. The first, which is, I think, kind of apparent from our discussion, is to enhance and promote the well-being and career success of our members, having these ethical quandaries and harms that occur when people are not able to fulfill goals they have with regard to publication or teaching or psychological safety at the social meeting because of something happening in the context of another colleague, we are harming. Right, and so, yes, I would like to enhance the well-being of members. The other issue is some of these issues that pertain to rights and opportunities for publication and data get to a larger issue, and it's the second problem that I personally think we need to work on solving, and that is to enhance the impact of the work we do in the world. And when these instrumental goals dominate over doing good work and helping people start their careers and doing work that's not to get the easy pub, but to get a meaningful contribution. A lot of these conversations people have, they're fighting for scraps. And because the scraps are about meeting some very small goal that probably trivial in the larger world, but incredibly important in the mind's eye of the doctoral student or the young faculty member. And that's the context of the work that we're doing that I think motivates more instrumentality than a value rationality. So that's key ideas I would share. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You mentioned tip of the iceberg, and I'm sure you've been privy to many things that we are average member of our academy are not aware of, and the pain you described and the importance of the problems enhancing the well-being of our members. And and having an impact on with the work that we do. I'm glad we're all at the same table to be having this kind of dialogue. Kathy?
So I appreciated setting the stage sort of with roles. That's very helpful. So I guess I'm approaching these questions from the role of being in governance, being in the academy structure, divisional leadership, and in editorial roles, probably continuously since about 1998. And currently I serve as co-editor-in-chief of Journal Management Education. And so when I think about the how, getting Jeff's questions, I think about it from a pretty pragmatic perspective, what I've seen over the years. And Denise and I had been emailing a little bit prior to the session, and it was a little bit like, oh, it's really hard to see what people are doing. It's lovely to be in these roles, but then you also kind of climb inside the honeycomb, and that's not always a nice place to be. And so when I think about emerging issues, I took your questions pretty literally.
Okay.
So the emerging issues, I don't know that they're actually new. I think that they are proliferating and they're getting more intense. And so there have always been, for example, pressures to publish. And I think those pressures to publish are proliferating into institutions that had not traditionally had that pressure. Even teaching-oriented institutions now are looking at metrics and looking at impact factors and looking at numbers of publications and kind of getting away from maybe the mission that they had of being very teaching-oriented to more of a ham-fisted, everybody has to publish, sort of hard stop. And that isn't going so well for people. Editorially, we'll see people just throw manuscripts at us sort of out of desperation, right? And they need help, and I think they're not getting the training and the mentoring that they need in order to be intentional and mindful about the outlets that they're choosing, the level of work that is needed for an initial submission, norms about self-plagiarism, things like that. And it's interesting to watch. And so I think if we're not attending to the incentives and the pressures that people are experiencing, particularly the junior folks, the doctoral students, they feel like their agency is really limited and they have to play along. And that lack of choicefulness shows up in a variety of ways. So I think we need, when I think about emerging, I think it's always been there, but it's increasing. And we just had at our editorial board meeting a really lively conversation about the proliferation of what used to be called predatory journals. Maybe all of you have in your inbox today invitations to publish and join editorial boards. And they've gotten very bold, they're very assertive, and the business model is very compelling for these phony outlets. And we used to be sort of unsuspecting about publishing in these because they're very smart about switching one word from a legitimate title. But now it's kind of moved into a symbiosis where we need to have these things on our CVs, and there is a wink and a nod about sending manuscripts into these outlets and getting a publication. And so from a predation standpoint, it's moved more into an opportunistic and sort of, again, a symbiotic relationship. And that's threatening for 100 reasons, but the quality and the legitimacy of our research is seriously under threat. And we need to engage with why people are doing that. And again, it kind of goes back to some of those incentives. But they're everywhere, and they're very aggressive. And there used to be a gentleman at Colorado State that kept a list of those, Jeffrey Beal, and he received so many death threats when he put a list up of these predatory outlets that he stopped doing it, and now that list is being curated in an anonymous way. So I think that's an interesting model. We've talked about the reproducibility issue within our research, and there was a recent article by Dolinsky, and it came out in Social Psychology Bulletin, looking at the number of papers published within the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology that actually studied behavior versus survey-based research. And the author found almost no research over a recent period of time, I think it's 10 years, was researching actual behavior, because that's hard and it takes a long time and you have to go through IRBs and it's messy. And we don't have time for that. So the amount of research that we're doing that's actually engaging, going back to what Linda said, actually engaging in the way people behave versus the way we think they might behave, the way they self-report that they behave, it's going down. And so we have to really think about what the consequences are of the way that we're pushing people to get their research out. And the last one that I'll talk about in this frame is something that I've been pretty worried about, which is the mismatch within the publication system itself. So the privileging of rewards for people who publish, like the authors themselves, are gaining all of the rewards and the kudos and the career advancement from a system that's largely invisible on the front end. So editors work for free, reviewers are not only volunteers, but they're invisible, and they do a bunch of intellectual contribution work for a publication, and the author is the only one benefiting from a system that depends on a citizenship model. And you may have also in your inbox an invitation to review. And you get lots of those. And so how do we parse out the disproportionate benefits of the publication system that are looking pretty unfair right now? We've been pretty worried. Because I'm pretty sure reviewing as it currently stands is not sustainable. And we've written about that. And so we really have to attend to that. How we should do this and how do we encourage others to do it, just I'm conscious of our time. Certainly modeling it and what Kelly said about managers always being on stage. I think as academics we are always on stage, particularly on a senior level. Doctoral students and junior faculty are looking to us to see what we actually do. Are we vetting our projects through the IRB, or are we cutting corners, or is the protocol really what we sent through IRB, or are we sort of tweaking that a little bit? Our behavior matters a lot in norming, and they're watching us all the time, and it leads to enormous cynicism when we don't walk that talk. And I think a lot about what do we want as a community. I was reading a book by Frederick Bachman, because I live in Minnesota and we are required to read books by Swedish authors all the time. And a book called Beartown, it's a delightful little book about hockey in Sweden, of course. And he talks about what makes a community. And he says, communities are a group of individual people who don't generally do what we want. They don't do what we want them to do. They do what we allow them to get away with. And a community is the sum total of our choices. And I think a lot about that characterization of us as an academic community. What do we want? Who do we want to be? And we have to be able to take some ownership over that choice set if we want things to change. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to Kathy and Denise and to Mark and to Kelly and to Linda and to Ed for following, or at least approximating, my heavy-handed suggestion to address these issues one at a time. And now, if you watch my little graphic, it's going to go together. And so, yeah. Okay, all right, yeah, ooh, ah. And so, thank you. There are really, by moving together, there are 4 opportunities here. The overlap between the what and the why, which can address issues such as are we, the findings as opposed to the arguments that Ed mentioned. How are those findings, how do they find their ways into what organizations grapple with? and the struggles that we hear and the complexities, both in terms of how to make it work, in terms of enacting ethical leadership and being visible, and to the morass of mess that probably operates behind the scenes that we don't find out about. Another point of overlap is between the what and the how, and that we have two types of organizations represented here. We have Allstate and JLL, we have the Academy of Management, and both taking a hard look at what it means to establish principles, whether they matter, and how do we track, how do we detect, how do we act on what might be ethical violations, and on the more positive side, how do we encourage ethics? The why and the how, we are in the business of producing knowledge that not only makes a difference in terms of our science, but also makes difference in the world of practice, of course, and we undermine our own capability of making those contributions if we are not ourselves behaving in ways that are ethical in how we approach what we do. So the types of violations that Denise talked about and Kathy talked about, they of course matter in terms of what the enterprise of our science is about and how it can contribute to practice. And so, and then right in the middle, the overlap of all three. I have no questions now. My only question is a request, and hope that that our panelists, in more of a free-form way, would like to comment on what are some thoughts that may have been triggered for you by hearing your counterparts, either within the own circle that I put you in, or across the panel. And let's just see where this might go. It's rare to have a collective of this caliber together, so I just want to turn the table over to you. Go ahead, Ed.
Well, two issues come to mind to me as I've listened to my colleagues. If I say to you, we have an ethics issue, please raise your hand if you immediately thought, oh wow, somebody's done something really good that makes the world better. Right? Well, see, that's a problem. The very idea of how we think about ethics is problematic. Now, again, philosophers have thought about this for thousands of years. And while you don't need to read that history, unfortunately I was forced to, ethics is a more nuanced idea than just judgments about right, wrong, good, bad. It's much more about how we frame things. And this is especially true in today's world because this idea of the world's changing so fast. A lot of the ideas that we have about ethics just don't work anymore because of new technology, because of new groups in society, because of new cultures, etc. So it's a much more nuanced idea than we have. And we have at least two background narratives that get in the way. In business ethics, we have a background narrative that I like to call, and we've seen a little bit of it in the panel today, the business sucks story. You know, business, it's morally questionable. It's a bunch, for the most part, of greedy little bastards, economic psychopaths, out trying to do each other in. And I think there certainly are plenty of those folks, and there are plenty of people out there who are just trying to do the right thing. The other narrative is something I would call saints and sinners. Because, you know, those companies that believe they're good, the first time Allstate makes a mistake, even though they're on this list, they automatically become sinners. Now, and so ethics is about, you know, saints and sinners. Oscar Wilde said this better than I ever could have. He said, every saint's got a past, every sinner's got a future. Ethics is a much more nuanced thing. If we are looking for perfection and for altruism, we will not find it on this earth. Right? So we need a much more nuanced idea about what ethics is than starting with decisions about good and bad and right and wrong. It seems to me there's much more work to be done on the front end. I would commend my colleague Bobby Parmar's work on looking at the Milgram experiments and how those got framed through the conversation that was there long before the decision to obey or disobey happened, as the kinds of things that you are uniquely qualified to do here.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So I was triggered by some of the things Mark said. So first of all, I think we have some evidence that it isn't as pathetic out there as Mark painted it. So what I've always found interesting is that if you ask people who work in organizations about business ethics in general, they would agree with you. You know, it's terrible out there. But if you ask them about their own organization, about their own manager, the numbers look a lot better. So I'm always wanting to caution us obviously the news media is not going to talk about, very often anyway, about companies that are trying to do things the right way, and people who are just, you know, being honest every day with their customers. It's so boring, right? So it's the Wells Fargos and the Theranos and the Ubers, and those are the stories that are juicy and that we hear a lot about. And so I think that our attitudes toward business ethics are skewed in a negative way by the media. The other thing I would say is that when we think about this as a whole system, and I'll point people, if they're not familiar with it, to ethicalsystems.org, which is a group I'm associated with, led out of NYU, that's trying to help people understand kind of organizational ethics, business ethics from a systemic perspective. There are things in the system that make it hard, I think, for companies to feel comfortable publishing their ethics data, for example. They worry that it's going to be used against them. There really aren't protections. And so if you're the lawyer whose first job is to protect the company, then your inclination is to perhaps put that on your intranet, but not put it on the internet. And so there are a lot of companies that are doing that, and the story that I love is that when Boeing started to do that, they had 30,000 hits a month to this website that showed the kinds of calls they were getting and how they were handling those, because people wanted to know. They wanted to know what was happening in the organization, and they wanted to know sort of that justice was being done. And so I have always thought that that was fascinating. The other thing I wanted to pick up on was this idea of, and there's actually some research out there on this, the burden of being seen as highly ethical. So I think being quietly ethical, is sometimes a good thing, because if you are seen as a kind of standout in some way in the ethical realm, and something goes wrong, you can actually pay more of a price. And I might get into trouble for talking about this, but I think we saw this at Penn State with the way attention turned to Joe Paterno rather than Jerry Sandusky, who was the person who actually engaged in child sexual abuse. But people said, well, Joe must have known he didn't do enough. And the reason they turned their attention to him was because he had really a 60-year reputation, not just at Penn State, but in college football, for being a moral beacon. He stood out and had done a lot of things the right way. So it's pretty the stuff is pretty complex. And the other thing I'll pick up on is this idea of what academic institutions are doing. And I've been involved. I serve on an ethics committee at Penn State that was formed after we had our scandal. which is now almost 7 years ago. And institutions of higher education have really moved since then to hire ethics and compliance officers, to set up infrastructures. I know, and Penn State has been, I look to them now as a leader in this. I know that they talk with a lot of other institutions. If you look at the Society for Corporate Compliance and Ethics list of positions that people are recruiting for, there are a lot of them in institutions of higher education that didn't exist before. So we have a lot of the same structures in place that companies do now, and that's all new. I don't know how good it is, but it's something that's happening out there, and it's different, and it might affect the lives of a lot of the people in this room.
Kathy, I know you want to get in.
Yeah, I was really struck by something you said, Ed, about the fear of making a normative statement. You know, we have people very fearful of throwing down a line and saying, this is not the right thing to do. And I thought your example of cruelty was really interesting. And as I was listening to what other people were saying, it also struck me that fear underlies a lot of what's happening. You know, the fear of an organization of being seen as unethical, or their CEO or their practices, and the fear of speaking out.
Well, there's also a fear of being seen as ethical because of the standard that you
The
held to.
standard, yes, yeah, the downsides
Yeah,
of
that's
that.
the separation
Yeah.
of ethics is the stuff,
Yeah.
and there's this other stuff over here.
Yeah, and I think, you know, Denise and I were emailing again prior to this, and I think that your initial orientation toward how you think people are matters a lot in the way that you approach this topic. If you think that, you know, again, going back to something you said, Ed, was if you think people are all kind of slobs and slimes and set out to defraud you, you're going to approach people and approach these processes in a really different way than if you think, you know, people are generally decent people. People generally set out to do the right thing, and then they, for a variety of reasons, get caught up in doing the wrong thing. And I wish that we could have some mechanisms by which we engage with the idea of fear and mitigate that. And I heard what Mark was saying, that ethical companies, being an ethical company doesn't mean bad things don't happen, but ethical companies take care of it and increase transparency and acknowledge it. And that seems like a huge step toward all of the issues that we're engaging with, is saying, you know, this happened, and here's how we're going to try to make that not happen again. And,
Can I ask that
yeah.
our practitioners get a chance to talk about
Yeah,
this?
sure.
We need your help, because you faced problems and with some level of exemplary action, took initiative, have experience. We're a community that is struggling with these issues, and we have a tendency to intellectualize them and the tendency to think it's somewhere else. And it's in the water that we swim in, our school of fish. Help us think about this. Can you share some of your thoughts?
You know, I go back to what Mark's comment about, just because you're an ethical company doesn't mean you think bad things don't happen. They do, and I think the point is you've got procedures, processes, policies in place that set a culture so that people have an ability to speak up through a variety of different methods to bring those issues up, knowing, and then there's processes when they've raised to be able to do the investigation, to do the analysis, those kinds of things. So that's a big piece of right there is having that structure in place and people knowing about it. It's kind of I always tell people 90% of my ethics job is marketing. It is really making sure when you've got employees across the world or whatever, make sure they know what we expect of them from an expectation of behavior and those kinds of things. Right. But also when you see something or something's going on, we want you to be able to raise it, and we want you to be able to raise it in a safe way, whether it's to your immediate manager, whether it's to an 800 number, anonymous, confidential, those kinds of things. So I think you've got to make sure you've got those things in place, and they are part of your DNA. It's not a once a year we send a reminder out, that type of thing. It's an ongoing, just as part of the conversation about everything. Leaders need to talk about, make sure their employees are aware that, hey, if you're not comfortable, come to me. Here's other ways we want you to raise this to the company. And we do some things Linda talked about, you know, where we we share some of the sanitized cases of things, because very candidly, some of those things are sexy that people they want to know that someone, ooh, this went on and someone got caught and here's what happened to them. We're not as far along as Mark's company is putting ours out on the internet as far as, but we did the last couple of years, I've gotten people comfortable with at least sharing with our employees, these are the number of cases we had this year, this is the number, how they were handled, those kinds of things. So being transparent on that at least gives people a comfort level that they can raise it up. But the other thing I guess I would also comment on is a couple of comments earlier about, code of ethics really oftentimes are fairly worthless. What really lies beneath that is what's your company's values. It should be simple, easily stated, and they're the kinds of things that I always tell folks, it's kind of like, don't lie, cheat, and steal. It's not a lot more complicated than that. And you need to reinforce those with folks, and they can see how that's demonstrated in the workplace versus this manual that's on a shelf that someone pulls out once in a while. They see how people demonstrate your values in every day and how they work together, how they work with their coworkers, how they work with their customers, that type of thing.
And as I've gotten old and cranky, I just think there's an intersection between the vast and really good, wisdom that there is in the psychological and social and behavioral sciences and data science, and sort of what goes on in any kind of an organization, no matter how big or small. There's this, we're not using that knowledge, I think, somehow to figure out how to get a message across to people, which I don't think is that complicated. I would love to get every manager of any other person, whether it's 1 or 80,000, somehow in a room and be able to say something that will keep them from going to the dark side. And there's something around abuse of power, I think, that we're not getting to people, because all these sexual harassment situations, really, they're about abuse of power. The people who are doing this stuff could go out and they have plenty of money to go pay for sex if they want it from people who aren't going to complain, right? But what are they doing? They're assaulting people who don't want it and whose careers are on the line, and that's an abuse of power. So I'd love to get all these people in a room and just say, leave your ego at the door. You are here to get paid to do a job for the benefit of shareholders, and just do your job. I'm not expecting people not to think about sex at work. If you see somebody attractive, we're all human, it's going to cross your mind. But what is it that keeps you to keep your hands off the merchandise? And that's a really interesting thing to me. But we're not getting the tools to talk to people in a way that's going to keep them from straying. We also don't have the controls always in place to stop stuff from people who are going to go over the line. So it's some combination of psychology, but also controls. Fascinating, for example, in Hollywood. So after all this stuff came out, now apparently there's a rule in Hollywood they had to put out there, it's not okay to have meetings in people's hotel rooms, which you would think people would
We banned that in the 90s.
Yeah, right, exactly. People should have sort of intuited this, but they didn't, so you have to tell them things. So there's some combination. So that's what I meant by, pathetic in that sense. Of course, there are a lot of great people around. It's the 2% that cause all the trouble, and it's disproportionate. But the damage they do is phenomenal, and nobody has an idea of how much this stuff costs to shareholders, to people's psychology, to people quitting. It's just astonishing. I can't even imagine what the true costs of this are or how you would even measure them. So I just want to say I think there's this intersection between the academia, which has done a lot of great work, but it's not getting to people like us unless we really go out. And that Ethical Systems is a great website. And I'm going to go spend some time in my dotage to go look at that, because I actually am interested in seeing if there's some way to, what are we not getting into companies, but we aren't.
Right.
And so I think that to me is the sort of really complicated issue. But the bottom line, I don't think it's, it's not that hard. I wish it weren't that hard to sort of get to the people who are running the show. And it's fascinating. Brilliant people who do amazing things and sort of push stuff to happen in the world. often have a fair amount of craziness as well. Or they're missing, they have a tin ear about some of this stuff, which is really interesting to me. But, you know, Steve Jobs had plenty of ethical issues. There's Elizabeth Holmes. You get somebody like an Elon Musk who, you know, tweets like somebody else we think about. You know, they can't stop themselves. So there's this sort of impulse control that people who get shit done don't have. And the rest of us, like, you know, I have a lot of impulse control, but I haven't gotten much stuff done like that. You know, I mean, I didn't go create the iPhone. But these are the people who end up running things. And boards of directors, for example, don't know how to control their thoroughbreds. I mean, this is another thing where you let somebody in charge who's going to get stuff done, but then they have this dark side that nobody's willing to put a lid on because of all the other stuff that they're doing and making money. So there's some, you know, on the one hand, it seems very simple, but we certainly haven't cracked the code.
Split it?
Yeah, you keep giving me ideas, things I want to talk about. So one of the things, I actually said this yesterday in a session, so I apologize if people were there who are here. But we have a lot of research on something we call abusive supervision. So these are basically supervisors, leaders who treat people badly. They're mean, they're hostile, they're aggressive, and there are all sorts of negative outcomes associated with that. And there are more of them in organizations than we would like to imagine. I'm sure you guys know this. And the thing that I think is, it just has bugged me forever, is how they manage to stay and get promoted and continue to abuse their followers. And when I've talked to people like you, I'm told that they're really good at sucking up. So that those who are higher than they are don't know how awful it is. So I have two things I'd like to I think I have two things I'd like to say. One is that getting ethics into the performance management system and those values that you were talking about, you know, we tend to focus on the things that are easy to measure and focus less on, is this person living the values? And I have found over the years, in my experience, there are companies that have really incorporated living the values into their performance management process. And they have also made that part of the performance evaluation at least equally important to the other part, the more measurable, you know, how many widgets did you sell, or, you know, what did you innovate or create, or whatever it is. And I had the ethics and compliance officer in one organization, a very good organization years ago, say to me, you cannot become a leader, you cannot advance in this organization unless you are doing really well on all of these ethics-related outcomes, you know, treating people with respect, et cetera. And so the question is, how do we know, if they're so good at sucking up, how do we know about them? And I'm kind of a fan of 360-degree feedback, which when I talk to people in organizations about it, there's a real kind of discomfort with it and fear about it. If we use it, we only use it for, you know, coaching. And I remember when I was a department chair, this is one of my favorite stories, my evaluation every year was done by the dean's office. And honestly, I didn't see the dean that often. At the time, she didn't see the day-to-day. She didn't know how I was treating people. I guess she wasn't getting complaints, right? But I said, do you ask the people in my department, the faculty, the doctoral students, do you ask these people, the staff, how I'm doing? How do you come up with an evaluation for me? And no, they didn't. They didn't. They, I guess, figured if I'm not getting any complaints, which we know how hard it is to get people to speak up. So I really think that organizations, if they can bake this into their performance management system and they can get the data about how these folks are actually behaving, they could do something. But it's, yeah, so I'd love to hear from you guys.
The one thought I have is the people you describe who treat people badly if they're still around, my guess is it's not more so much that they probably are good at sucking up, but to me it's more like they've gotten results.
Yeah,
So along the year, they're able to produce the results.
Right,
They get the companies looking for, and people sometimes tend to look the other way.
right.
Until something blows up somewhere along the way. But I think over the years, I've seen that, and especially
Sure.
if they operate in a, I want to say, a remote location where they're not
Yes.
necessarily seeing their leader on a regular basis, those types of things.
Yes.
I think you see that. I agree about, incorporating in performance management. We've struggled with this over a number of years, but we now have what we call leadership principles, which incorporate our values into, and along some other leadership behaviors we expect from every employee. But it's 50% of our performance review, so it counts the same as our
that's
business
good.
goals, that type of
That's
thing.
good.
But it's not easy to do because oftentimes it's subjective.
Yeah,
So,
more subjective, yeah.
quite candidly, when I sit down with my employees and we talk about those, I ask them, okay, so I ask them to tell me, how have you exhibited that? So I mean, I can go around and I can get feedback from folks, but I want to know, how did you exhibit it? How do you see yourself living in that? And then the other thing I've just come is, I'm not a fan of 360s. And the main reason is that over the years I've seen them is people tend to pick the people that, they think will give them the good reviews. And oftentimes
well,
people.
they shouldn't get to pick.
But even if they do it among their own folks, oftentimes it's that same thing. Okay, if they're a bad leader, I'm not going to say anything bad.
Right.
We try a number of other surveys throughout
Right.
our corporation to try
That can be
and
a
ferret some of this out. But I think you have to just keep trying things to
Yeah.
figure some of that out.
Yeah.
Make a process observation. We just have a few minutes left in this room, and I do want to provide you the opportunity to raise some questions and speak with our panelists. The bulk of that, the opportunity for that will be happening behind that wall in the other room, is room number 6? 6? Okay, so we'll have a 30-minute coffee session after this, so we'll be moving to that location and giving you an opportunity to mill about and talk with our panelists about some issues that you will have in mind. There's your happy faces right there. So let me close with a couple of observations and really a kind of call for action. First of all, listening to the dialogue exchange among our panel members strikes me as there are some common, that small spot in the middle where the triple overlap can be. We've heard about how we are hesitant to be definitive in what we say and conclude in ethics research. As academics, we do the proverbial "it depends," or we equivocate on our findings pending further research. Whereas organizations rely on, even with subjectivity involved, rely on evidence, data, to be able to determine where the ethical issues stand, notions of compliance, and notions of enforcement. And have had, the companies represented here have had far more years of experience than our own academy has, as we are in a sense, grappling with some issues that have many parallels. But again, just saying it, writing a code doesn't mean it matters. It needs to be translated into behaviors that we understand and we can communicate, that are exemplified by people in positions of leadership. Whether there's enough cross-chatter between what happens from a research standpoint and how that translates into practice, and I think really listening the other way, and so that as researchers develop their own agendas around ethical issues, that we're working on the same kinds of issues that you may be struggling with, and so that we can have a profitable exchange on occasions that are more frequent than the one we're hosting today. So a couple of closing comments. So this spotlight that is this plenary is couched in terms of, it's an annual, year-long initiative, as I mentioned, that draws from this plenary session that you've seen as a kind of starting point. So this is the beginning of a focus for the coming year. We will be seeking, and now I'm speaking as the officer of the Organizational Behavior Division, we'll be seeking input from our membership to take the ideas that we've been talking about today and others, ideas around issues around ethics, and translating them into action items. This could be any of a variety of things. This could be planning some further dialogues with representatives from the corporate world, from the world of practice. It could be special issues for journals, for example, that are helping to leverage the overlap that we saw today, perhaps taking a look at our profession from an ethical standpoint, taking a look at some best practices perhaps in the corporate world, and shining a light on them, if you will. Planning for next year's meeting, and so we will have additional events that could be of this type. We have the Connect at AOM, which not all divisions are part of yet. The OB division is one of, I think, about 8 that have already made the transition. So you may have received messages about the conference that are pushed out to you through that mechanism. But it's a new way to communicate, where we can, as I said, do stage discussions, brainstorm some sessions that we may plan using the forum for brainstorming itself, and doing some action planning. So I will make a commitment that I stand ready to hear your ideas, help to facilitate some collective action that may be of value that's linked to ethics. So I encourage you, I charge you to get involved. The opportunity is there. It takes some initiative on your own. I'm not expecting you to have an idea right now that you're going to commit to, but think about it. This session has been recorded, and so you might want to go back and reflect on it and see what some of our panelists have said and how that might stimulate your ideas. Get involved, spread the word beyond this room. If our spotlight initiatives are going to matter, then they require action, and the action falls in the hands of folks such as yourselves and our other 6,000 plus members of the division. So we're going to conclude and go to coffee. Before we do that, let's once again thank our panelists. This has been, I think, a remarkable discussion.